Are you ready?
I think so. Should I test
Yeah,
the mic
applause.
again? Is everything?
Yeah, I think it works. So, hi everybody. I think today is our 11th Groktalk. And as you know, Groktalks are about grokking and talking. So the first part today, Eric is going to be to present us with. I'll let you know about what. So the first part is the presentation, and the second part is networking and talking to each other, getting to know each other. I think, as always, product-related talks are very popular in Yerevan. I don't know why, but that's a good sign. So Eric works at Vineti. He's a principal designer at Vineti, and Vineti creates complex tools for delivering therapies. If I'm not mistaken, please correct me if I say something wrong. And this is something that the product that enterprises use it, and so it's very complex. It's very big. There are a lot of limitations, regulations, and also a lot of configuration job to do to use the tool that they create in a enterprise and company that's going to use it. So that's very complex product design work that Eric does at Vineti, and I think he's going to tell us about all the intricacies that they have in their work. So this is going to be a very interesting talk today. So please enjoy. Eric.
Thanks, Vanis. Okay, so let's see how well all of this works. Feel free to submit questions. While I'm talking, I'll take questions at the end, but you can ask stuff anytime during the talk and then upvote it and whatnot, and I'll come back to it when I'm finished. It'll probably be 30 minutes-ish if I don't talk too slowly. So yeah, I'm here to talk about challenges in product design, a little bit about general product design, but also about specific areas with sort of extra challenges and complexities. So product design can be pretty simple, right? All of us who are designers here, you go and find some group of people, observe them, see what their problems are, come up with some ideas, test them out, take the feedback, and make it better, right? And then you can create a product. But a lot of things can make that process more complicated if you are designing enterprise software, if you're building a platform, right, tools for other people to build stuff on top of, or if you work in a regulated industry with a lot of government laws. So I'm here to talk about a little bit of general design process, specific examples from each of those areas, and some of Vineti's experiences working on those pieces. So who am I? What is Vineti? What do we do? How do we plan to take over the world? So I'm Eric. I came into UX design through information science. So I wanted to be a librarian. I like to organize information, and I thought, that's great. I'll go to grad school to organize stuff. And then I discovered HCI and design and UX. And here I am 10-ish years later. I've spent time working at some big companies, a little time at Microsoft. I've been at a couple agencies, consultancies in Seattle and Tokyo, and then the last few years I've worked in the Bay Area at various startups, and now at Vineti for the last 5 or so years. In my spare time, I like strategic board games and dancing and indie RPGs where you collaborate to tell stories. So this isn't just me. The rest of our design team at Vineti, we're based in North America and in Armenia. These are great folks, especially if you're around here. We have 2 designers in Armenia, Christina, who's actually at this talk, and Anahit. Great people to meet and learn more about design offline. And so a lot of the work that I'm representing is everybody's work. So what is Vineti? Vineti is a platform that allows us or others to configure a sort of complicated process to orchestrate personalized cell and gene therapies. So these are complicated treatments that involve a lot of locations and a lot of people working together to treat one person of a particular disease. Yeah, what else was I saying about this? Oh, right. And so by automating all of this, by creating a configurable platform, we allow pharma companies who are developing these treatments to get to market, get commercial approval. And then the faster we can help them do that, the faster those treatments can scale and more patients can get access to them sooner. Certainly sooner than if every pharma company was trying to become a software company and develop their own tracking methods for each of these. So what is personalized medicine? What are cell and gene therapies? So cell and gene therapies are technically a manufacturing process. So like if you're making an aspirin, right, a pill for headaches, there are regulations for manufacturing that drug. And there's a lot of, you have to, in your factory, keep track of ingredients and keep it clean and do a lot of quality control. But you can do it all in one place and you're making a few thousand pills and then you can ship them to anywhere and anybody can use them. With cell therapy or a gene therapy, these are treatments where the raw ingredient is the patient's cells. So their blood cells, their tumor tissue cells, and those have to be collected in a hospital. So you have to take all of the manufacturing processes and rules and do them in a hospital and then ship them to a manufacturing facility and then ship them back to a hospital to the patient. And on top of that, because you're using one person's cells, that drug, that dose at the end can only be used by them. So you're not making 1,000 doses for anybody, you're making one dose for one person. So it's a much more complicated process and the need for precision is much higher, right? If it's a treatment for, say, leukemia, which re-engineers white blood cells, those white blood cells, a high dose of them are dangerous to anybody who isn't the patient. So a sick patient really needs them. If you give them to the wrong person, you might also hurt them. And so because of that complexity and need for precision, Vineti exists to ensure that all of that goes smoothly at scale, because this is too much to do manually, essentially. So even in regular medicine, right, medical errors are common. They cause a lot of problems, a lot of damage. And so trying to do this on an even bigger scale with a lot more moving parts is really why Vineti exists as a company, to safely orchestrate and automate these treatments so that even doing something much more complicated, it can be done safely with fewer mistakes. So design process. So this is sort of the basics for designers in the room. Just going to talk about the general design process as baseline, and then we can go from there into sort of special areas. So as you'll probably know, right, there are a lot of layers to UX, right, a lot of aspects to what goes into design. There's obviously the UI and what it looks like. There is how it works, how it behaves. And you click on something, what happens, where do you go, what are the interactions? How is it all organized, right? What is the content that you're actually trying to present to people? Where should it go so that they can find it, right? And of course, what do the users actually need and what is the business trying to do? Like, all of this goes into designing a product and good user experience. And this is from Jesse James Garrett's book, Elements of UX. Classic diagram, shamelessly stole. So skills and roles. A lot of design is a bucket of skills, right? There's the interaction, the information architecture, and content, and analytics. And each of us may have strengths in specific areas. I come from library science, so information architecture and a lot of the organization, right, is my specialty in sort of diagramming information. But there are a lot of visual designers, graphic designers, folks who come from, say, data science, engineers who taught themselves UX. A big bucket to choose from. And depending on the company that you work at, those might be grouped into different roles, right? So you might work at a place where, say, there's a product designer who does most of that, and then a product manager who does sort of the business needs and the prioritization of the stories, and then engineers building the front end. Or the opposite, you might work in a place where there's graphic designer mocking things up and doing high fidelity work, and then the product managers are doing research and sort of wireframes and sketching. Or you might work in a big company where everyone is specialized. You have information architects, you have researchers, you have graphic designers, you have data scientists. So lots of different ways to sort of capture and bucket these skills and how many hats everybody wears. Of course, the basic design process is an iterative process of going and seeing a problem, right? Trying to find a group that you're trying to help improve something that they're doing, attempting to solve that, coming up with ideas, testing them, and repeating and refining until you have something good. So this involves a lot of diamonds, generating a lot of ideas, whittling them down, trying a lot of things, narrowing them down to the promising ones. So that might look like, on the research end, gathering information and synthesizing it. Interview lots of people, take lots of notes, and then distill it down into key personas and primary scenarios, something that you can really focus on coming up with a solution for. It can be generating a lot of sketches and wireframes and prototypes and possibilities, and then narrowing them down to the most promising ideas, the most promising directions, so that you can go test them with users, and so on. But that's not what I'm here to talk about. We all know basic design stuff. Here, I'm going to talk about all of the fun problems that can make this even harder and more complicated, starting with enterprise software. So enterprise generally talks about software that is built for a large organization, right? So it's not something that you as an individual consumer might decide you want to go out and use. It's something that your giant company needs to manage personnel or payroll or finances or PTO or all the information that you make or all the documents that you manage, those sorts of things. So there are a lot of classic tensions with enterprise software. As a designer, one of the biggest ones, you're used to finding your users, empathizing with your users, building solutions for your users. But if you're making enterprise software, your customer is the business. It's a manager or an admin, someone who has a budget and has things that they want. They want features checked off, right? And they can feel like they're in the way of, but I'm trying to help your staff, your employees. Let me talk to them and solve their problem. And so you have to balance both the access to the users who might be gatekept by the buyer rules. You have to learn to be empathetic with the buyers, because as designers, we don't usually think about really having good feelings about people who are just trying to spend as little money as they can to solve a problem. But they're your stakeholders too. And then, of course, getting access to your users. If they are in this group that's specialized with specific needs, you can't just walk into Starbucks and get feedback from some random person about your designs, because they don't have the context or the specialization to give you useful feedback. Service design, as a concept, I would say becomes much more important in enterprise tools, where you're thinking about the front stage and the backstage, the people who are sort of exposed to it and the people who have to do work behind the scenes to make a complicated process work. And then again, depending on what kind of company you're designing, what kind of software you're designing for, it might be this big software suite that's been around for a long time and it's really hard to change. If you're making an app and you want to refactor it, there's a lot less to rebuild it, right? It might be something you could actually do in a reasonable amount of time. With an enterprise suite, generally those are long projects of replacing old technology with newer, better technology, which is its own challenge and causes things to go slowly. So what that looks like at Vineti is our buyers are pharma companies, right? These are drug manufacturing companies, pharmaceutical companies who are developing personalized treatments. So it's the executives and the directors who are in charge of figuring out how to market and release and coordinate all of this, deciding, do we need Vineti? Does it do what we want? Our users are some of their staff, so folks in operations and, mostly operations and manufacturing, who are a little hard to get access to because we have to get their boss's permission, but at least we have a direct line of communication. But our other users are in hospitals, so nurses, sometimes doctors, and they are even harder for us to get access to because we have to go through the pharma company, and the pharma company considers them to be a customer, and so they're really hesitant about using their social capital to help us talk to their customers. They'd rather control that relationship. And even if we do have a direct relationship with a hospital, hospitals are also pretty cagey about their time, right? You can't just walk in and talk to a nurse who's working with a patient. Like, there's PHI, there's privacy issues. They're very, very busy. The sick people are much more important than you are, right? So it's a big challenge, and we have to get pretty creative about finding relevant people to get feedback from and figuring out creative ways to get in to sort of do observational research and things like that. And then patients aren't actually even a user, right? We're making all of this with patients as a focus, but they're sort of the donut hole in the middle, and we're building the donut. They don't actually touch our software, even though it's for them. And so that's an interesting challenge, right? Where we don't really talk to the person who is most impacted by what we do. So an example of service design at Vineti. So for us, the front stage is the users of the interfaces as the tool. So in the hospital, a nurse who is collecting blood from a patient is using our tools to confirm the patient's identity and enter data about the patient. At a manufacturing facility or at a pharma office, there's someone who is keeping track of the treatment and managing orders. And so those are sort of our front stage users. But in the backstage, there is all of the other people, integrations with courier systems or folks in the pharma company who aren't using any of those tools, who are coordinating day to day to make these processes happen, right? It's the business logic behind the scenes. We have to think about this as a service design problem because it is this long, complicated process that has to be a single process. It has to be one holistic workflow, but our users only see one slice of it. They use this tool here in the hospital, or they use this tool here at the pharma company. And so having that holistic vision is one of our challenges. So platforms. So taking this to the next level. So platform is a vague word. It can be defined in a lot of different ways. For now, I'm talking about platforms that are a suite of tools, sort of an ecosystem that other people can come in and use those tools to then build and run software on that service, in that system. So Salesforce is a classic example of a platform. People come and use Salesforce to build applications on Salesforce. So moving from, say, enterprise or building an application to building a platform instead of, a static design system, you're talking about how to make that system into configurable pieces that can be reused by themselves without the design team. So instead of designing an application, you were designing now the tools for other people to build the application. So at Vineti, that is sort of what it sounds like, right? We go from here is our style guide with all of our atomic components and even our more complicated components and all the things that the design team knows how to put them on the screen and what the spacing needs to be and things not to put together. But now that we are creating tools for other people to combine those, we have to create guidelines for what you can use together. You can't just put 3 buttons in a row. You can have text in a button, or you can have a text in a toggle, or you can have one primary CTA for a screen. And now we have to teach other people those rules. And we also have to determine what the range of that flexibility should be. So we go from the patterns that we're familiar putting together to figuring out which patterns should be usable by somebody else, right? Of all the things that we've seen, we can throw anything on a screen in Figma, but we can't just let anyone throw anything on a screen, right? It has to actually work together. And so we have to sort of figure out what's the limited number of useful things that other people can reuse, and how much should they be allowed to change them before it can break, and how much do they need to change it because they're going to encounter new things that we haven't encountered because now it's more people trying to solve more problems. And then service design itself becomes more complicated. So before, front stage was users of the applications and backstage was kind of internal coordination. Now the front stage is the people who are using our platform to build those applications. So they're sort of another layer of implementation configurer teams. And then backstage ends up being, what do we as a company need to build? What documentation, what tools, what processes do we have to prepare in order to support and enable those teams who might be internal users today? They might be partner companies tomorrow on our ecosystem. All of that has to be prepared. So that top diagram is an example of a service blueprint of configuring our service, right? So the first step is somebody builds it, right? The engineering team builds the functionality. And then most of it is, okay, first you have to define what the context is, and you have to create the structure, and then you have to configure each of the steps, and then you have to add the integrations and the SSO and the notifications and all of that in order to create a functional service. And this lower diagram is the even bigger view of this. Okay, hey, if there's a company that wants to work with us and use our tools, how do they learn we exist? How do we onboard them to use those tools? How do we train them so that they know what they're doing? And then they have to go through that process, and then they have to figure out how to deploy it, right? So it's all these things that we're used to doing internally that now now we have to figure out how to enable everybody else to do without having access to talk to us. And so essentially teaching other companies and other teams, other non-designers, how to think like a designer, how to put things together that are still usable, to not take our platform and create some monstrosity that well-meaning but doesn't actually work, where we want to make sure that people using our tools can also make stuff that is usable and solves those problems well. So a lot of that is now working with other teams. I mean, I guess obviously we've always been working with other teams, but in platform design in particular, design cannot do this alone, right? You need tech writers, you need engineers, you need PMs, you need customer success to work together to create that documentation, to translate what the design team knows into the ways to communicate that and those guidelines to everybody else. And then of course you can build in constraints. You can say, okay, you can change these 3 things, but you can't change this 4th thing. And that can help you avoid dangerous situations, right? Prevent your customers from hanging themselves building something that won't work. But there's also a trade-off. You risk, if you put in too many constraints, then it's possible that someone who is trying to configure a solution for a new problem that you haven't seen, you prevent them from solving that problem. Just because if you only build for the patterns you know, then no one else can build for new patterns and new problems. So the flexibility is also important. That said, the flexibility is, it's harder to build those constraints. So it's much easier to write documentation and say, please follow these rules. And then when you have more time, you can build in functionality that prevents dangerous use. So it's both a trade-off and also something that just takes a longer time to get to. So finally, regulated industries. Regulation is the dry, boring part of this talk. Regulation has a lot of associations with things take a long time. They're really annoying and tedious processes. You can't do anything new or innovative. I think a lot of designers tend to avoid regulated industries and because it feels like there's just not, you don't get to do the new fun stuff. But the reason those industries are regulated is often because those companies did something that had a big impact on people in the past, right? Patients were harmed, consumers were hurt, the industry was not responsible, and now there are rules to keep those people safe. But the reason why those rules need to exist is because the industry had a big impact, right? If you make something like cars, then you have a lot of responsibility to keep the people who are driving your cars safe, and so anything you do wrong is going to have a big legal sort of reaction to fix it in the future. Industries that are not particularly regulated, maybe they're brand new and the world just hasn't gotten to trying to pass laws about them yet, but maybe it's because they don't actually have a big impact, right? And so the temptation to sort of do new, fun, fast things is definitely there, but a lot of these regulated industries are the places that actually have the biggest effect on the most people, right? There's the biggest need to fix things, to fix old systems and old ways of doing things, and the biggest opportunity to have that real impact on the world that I think motivates a lot of us. So, because they tend to be older industries with a lot of established processes, those can be hard to change. There is a law that says you have to do this thing, and everyone has read that law and decided what they think that means, and they've now done it that way for 10 years, and no one sued them, so that's the correct way to do things. And it's hard to convince them you should do it some other way. But if you actually go read the law says, don't do this thing, not do it this way. And so there's an opportunity to find a different solution, a different way to solve that problem that is better than what everyone's used to doing, right? That's where you can innovate in a regulated industry. But then, of course, you have to convince everyone that that's safe and it's not risky to try something new. And so trying to change everyone's minds, right? It's an enterprise that's trying to change complicated software. In regulation, it's trying to change a large group of people who've decided what they think. And that culture change is hard. So in Vineti, the biggest impact of this, which doesn't necessarily affect, say, the design team directly, is the need to validate our software. Because we're making software that affects patients and medical processes and captures sensitive information, there is an entire process to both say, this is what our stuff should do, this is how it should work, this is the way it's being set up, and then parallel to that, this is how we're going to test the way it's set up, and this is how we're going to test that it's doing what it says it's going to do, and this is the way that we test that it meets all the settings that we said that we set for it, right? So there's a bunch of planning and a bunch of testing that goes into anything that we make. So unlike consumer apps, which is where I worked before this, right? You can't move fast and break things. You can't move fast because you have to test everything before you can actually release it and get feedback. So the feedback loop is very slow, sometimes frustratingly slow. And everything is about avoiding patient risk. So breaking stuff is potentially really dangerous, right? So we have to be a lot more careful and in some ways a lot more conservative. So this is all sort of to set up the next few examples that from a design perspective might feel really simple, and why is this an interesting example? But in healthcare, these are all big wins. Maybe I shouldn't, I think I'm selling myself too short here, sorry about that. So passwords is an example, right? A lot of us are familiar with the old password rules. You gotta have numbers and symbols and letters, and it has to be 8 characters. But if you've done any research on how people actually use passwords, if you're familiar with your own password habits, perhaps, you know that it's easy to get around those by substituting really common numbers and letters, and just 8, 9 characters will be fine, and reusing passwords across different places, right? Or writing it down because it has to actually be hard and it's really hard to remember. And we know now that those are really predictable things, people's behavior. Either they write it down and it's not secure, or they make it really easy to guess and it's not actually a hard password to guess at all, the opposite of the purpose. And the best thing actually is to have just a long sentence. Maybe not a grammatical sentence, maybe some random words, but just a bunch of words that are really memorable. You can have a nice little mnemonic. A lot of you have seen the XKCD comic. And that's the way to have passwords that are better because they're actually more secure as a level of entropy to crack, but also because they're easier to use too, right? It's just win-win. And yet, an industry that's used to all these old password requirements, it's very hard to convince them, no, we're not defining this with the number of characters and the types of characters. We're defining this with the level of entropy. And they're like, that sounds like a made-up word. And so essentially selling this to our customers, guiding how we can make this easier for them and solve their problem better and make their users' lives better, is its own uphill battle. Ironically, we've deprecated this entire example because as we've grown as a company, we realize that password management is not a strategic focus, and there are lots of other companies that we can integrate to do that with. So this was an early days win that stopped being super relevant. So another big deal was signatures. So I've talked about how Vineti is a system that automates all of these treatments, that orchestrate stuff. And so as much as possible, we want to actually confirm and check the status of everything with the system. The courier sends us updates so we know where a shipment is. You can scan a label and make sure it's the right label. But there's some things that can't actually be done automatically, right? Vineti, the system, cannot look at a patient's ID and confirm that this is the same person, for instance. If a person hands a physical object to somebody else, we can't see that happening in the system. And so at some point, we need a manual strong confirmation that we believe it. Not just someone checking a box or clicking next, but someone who has to stop and say, okay, this is a legal signature, I have to sign this thing happened, so that we feel confident that we're still tracking accurate things. So electronic signatures are that answer. So there are a lot of regulations around how to do electronic signatures so that they have the same legal weight as a physical signature. But since we're not using paper, has to be on the interface. And so you have to have, when this happened, you have to have a unique ID and a unique password and a reason for signing. And so the initial request for this is, well, of course, pop up a modal and have them fill out, put in their username and put in their password and type in a reason. But actually, we know what the reason is. We've configured this step in the process. There's only one thing that they are signing for, so that's not going to change. And we already know who they are because they're logged in. So sure, they can put in their password again, but we don't need to ask them for their username, right? So we can save a lot of steps in this process. And these, I feel like coming from the consumer app, this is obvious. Like, why would you just ask redundant stuff over and over again? And yet that was the default starting point of some of our pharma customers, what they sort of expected and were used to. Another little innovation of ours was double signatures, right? If you have to have two signatures, then the first answer is, oh, well, of course, you have to have the second person, they have to sign out. First person signs out, second person logs in, and they have to go find the order and then go find the step and then make sure they're on the right step, and then they can do the simple e-signature. And that derails the entire process. So we managed to have a second signature live, right? So without the first person logging out, someone else can come in, put in a little bit more of their credentials, but they can sign it in context, both people standing there at the same computer, and then the work can move on. You don't have to log out, log in, worrying about getting lost. So as small and repetitive a block as having two signature buttons on the screen, this was definitely an early win for us. So PHI and PII, protected health information and personally identifiable information, are a big deal in medicine, right? We all have private medical data. We don't necessarily want people to see our names on medical forms or on screens. And so everybody who uses our system is trained and qualified to either be allowed to see patient information or not be allowed to see that. Great, what do? We have this tracking screen that has, all of the information about this order, but these other people want to have access to it. But they're not allowed to see anything about the patient. So I guess we're just going to have to build a second version, or they just have to ask somebody for that information. And so instead of dealing with multiple versions of things, we went with, well, why can't we just tag in the database what all these categories of sensitive information are? And so we, at the data level, identify what is PHI, what is PII, and then dynamically, when someone logs in, we can just mask that information if they aren't allowed to see it. So this way, we don't have to worry about information being missing, where someone doesn't even know that they don't have access to something. They can see that it's there, but it's just asterisks. And we don't have to worry about, did we check that this page does or doesn't have information that this person may someday see, that we have to now police a complicated set of access permissions. As a highly regulated process, there are also regulations for what do you do when something goes wrong. So if something goes seriously wrong, there's a CAPA, corrective action and preventative action. So this means, hey, something bad happened, how are you going to fix it? And what are you going to do so it doesn't happen again? And so this is a formal process that we have to go through either ourselves or with our customers. If anything, for instance, happens with a patient involved with our system or so on. And so in this case, someone put in the wrong units, right? Someone was used to imperial units and they put in metric or vice versa. And it turns out that that's actually really important because that unit is used to calculate the dosage at the end. So it's not just that the information would be wrong, which would also be bad, right, for tracking accurate data out of treatment. But it had the potential, if you're doing pounds to kilograms of something as almost 2.5 times what it should be as a dose, right? And that could be dangerous to the patient. So this is a serious problem that happened a couple times. So what do you do about that? So our customers were really panicked about this. They came and said, okay, we need a modal. When they click next, there has to be a modal that pops up and it blocks the screen and it says, you put in this. Did you mean this, right? Do you want to go back and correct it? Did you mean kilograms? And just do that a couple times and then we'll feel okay. And it's like, well, most users didn't have any problem with this, right? Most people weren't confused. It was a mistake that happened in a rare case, so we'd be impacting essentially every single person who wasn't having any usability issues, interrupting their work for something that mostly didn't affect the process. And think about, this is a workflow where there are lots of fields with units, right? Units, you can get units wrong anywhere. So what are we going to do? Put in modals, every 5 minutes to confirm that someone got that right. So there are a lot of obvious problems with that solution. And so we ended up stepping back and taking a breath and saying, hey, let's think about this, and coming up with, well, what if we just do a live conversion? They type in something and then next to it we say this would be this many pounds, right? Or this many deciliters. And it's something that moves when they type, nice little JavaScript, and the person typing there can notice that and see, oh wait, that's weird, I should double check. Or they can just move on, it doesn't interrupt, doesn't get in the way. And you could configure that for any field in the workflow if someone thinks it's necessary. It'll be a little visual noise, but it won't interrupt the process. So that was an example of trying to work to come up with something that was a little more innovative, a little more usable than sort of the instinctual quality users at our customers who wanted to be careful about everything. So that's the talk. Remember, as designers, always practice the basic skills. It will never lead you wrong. If you're working on enterprise stuff, it's big, it's complicated, it's going to be hard to change, but try to empathize with all of your stakeholders. Platforms are very meta and very complicated. Don't feel like you're stuck doing the obvious design things. Go work with all the other teams. Make sure there is holistic design vision throughout the process, throughout the company, even if it doesn't feel like an obvious design problem like the ones you used to work on. And in regulated spaces, go back to the letter of the law. Look for opportunities to interpret it in a better way. Don't just take everyone's assumptions and what they're used to doing. So thank you very much. I hope some people submitted questions. And I'm also happy to take questions live if we didn't get any.
Actually, it doesn't work.
Doesn't work?
I tried it, yeah.
Ah, so much for my experiment.
It says that you do not allow to ask questions.
What? But it's turned on.
Yeah. No, it's it.
Accepting question. Oh, accepting questions from Vineti. Accepting questions from anyone. Oh.
Okay, but we can ask questions like that.
Oh, rookie mistake. If you had a question that you were trying to type in, maybe you can hit enter now. Maybe copy and refresh. I don't know. I mean, you can also just raise your hands. It's trying to give the quieter folks a chance to say stuff. But yeah.
So you said about writing the rules and templates and kind of guidelines for the companies who write applications on the platform.
Yeah.
What does it look like? A typical guideline? What it includes? What kind of limitations do you include in it? Kind of like you cannot do 2 buttons in a row or something like that. How does it look? Besides the design system that you provide them.
Yeah. It's so there are 2 parts to it. There's the built-in constraints, and then there's the documentation and guidance. So part of it is that we've built the blocks, the components that can be reused. So we don't allow someone to just add buttons. They have to add a text and button, and the button usually has a purpose, right? Or a text and a scanning field, or so those options are limited to begin with. So that sort of constrains things. The other half of guidance has been really iterative. Earlier I showed a screenshot of a relatively nice Polage, GitHub page with examples and whatnot. That's a recent development that is, I think, a big improvement, maybe comment. But is essentially a description of how it works with code snippet examples of what configuring it looks like, but then also sort of good and bad examples. So on a page, do it this way, don't do it this way. The stuff that could be configured, we try to provide the better and worse approaches as examples in the documentation for how to use it.
And do they have to really write code, or they just write a configuration YAMLs or things like that?
It's mostly YAML. I think we initially, our early ambitions were that we were going to make something that was configurable by completely non-technical people, and then that turned into, I'm sure non-technical people can learn YAML, that'll be fine. And then it turned into other things. But yeah, so it is a lot of text configuration, and so that has to have has to be validated and kind of it doesn't just write itself. It's not WYSIWYG yet. But
yes. And so
someday.
you actually code your design in those YAMLs?
No, our designs are in Figma.
In Figma.
Yeah, and so the designs are used. So product design will design the things, PMs will translate, and the stories engineers will then build the components and build the configuration. We'll specify this is what it should be and this is what should be editable, and then that'll be built by engineers into the configurable pieces that then the configuration teams can, say add in YAML, add this block with these settings.
Oh, okay. So you have the predefined components with the strict design that you can use in your configuration. And your customers say I need this kind of component, and the developers build it, and then you can have in your YAMLs this component.
Yeah, in a nutshell. It's definitely messier than that, but that is fundamentally the process. Who else? Questions?
As far as I understood, you provide your solutions to third-party companies and teams to build their own products, right?
Both. So we're in the middle of transitioning to other people using our tools. Right now, we configure most things internally. So actually, so I mentioned in enterprise, there's challenges having access to your users. If you work in the company who uses your software, you're really lucky because your coworkers are your first test users. And we're still mostly in that phase. So most of our configuration teams are still internal at Vineti. A lot of them are based here in Yerevan. And then we are working towards anybody else being able to use those.
So nobody, third-party companies cannot use these components and build their own products. If they can, how do you handle that monitor, whether they do it the correct way or not?
Yeah, the short answer is that we're working on it. So we do have partners.
What's the punishment for doing something wrong?
Yeah, so we do have third-party partners now, but not anybody can't just go to developer.vineti and sign up. It's still a bit more of a process to pick and choose our first customers.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm not seeing any questions.
Is there any part of your product suite that is more, I assume it's all SaaS-based. Are there any specific things like with SaaS and regulated industry that make things hard for you?
It's a good question. Is there anything about SaaS that is inherently harder? I mean, I think my sense, I feel like overall everything is easier because we're not dealing with on-premise, is this updated or that updated? I mean, there are a lot of challenges updating an entire platform when everyone is going to get those updates live, right? There's a bunch of testing and a bunch of confirmation, and that's a huge headache. But we can do it all at once. We have to send somebody to a bunch of offices to change those things and test those things. I think probably the biggest problem for us being in the cloud is that hospitals are used to on-premise. And so the idea of saying, oh, you have to open up this network port in order to make sure your users can access our system is new for some hospitals who are used to saying, install this on your local server. But once they do that, again, it's easier to manage, it's easier to see, it's easier to go in and troubleshoot because we can actually access it if needed. So yeah, I don't know. Apavan, do you feel like there are any specific SaaS challenges to the regulation? Just besides everyone being skeptical of it?
I mean, in hospitals, right, whenever something goes down, it's panic. So yeah, even if it takes like just a few minutes to update everything. Yeah. And there's a lot of stakeholders. There's like a couple of, the issue might come to you from 10 different,
Right.
sources, let's say.
Anybody can submit a help request.
So it's kind of messier a little bit. But yeah, so far I think there's no other better option so far, I guess.
Yeah, even on-premise has to have a backup to paper plan.
What about the data storage? You have to store it in some particular way?
I can't answer that at all.
There's one thing called ISDC. It's a standard. I think usually most of the pharmas, most of the hospitals need to have that. And we're in a direction of having everything like compliant. There's a couple of ways, but usually pharmas tend to they're basically saying it's our data, so we should own it, and they usually collect data from because they use hundreds of different vendors, right? They collect everything in one data lake and try to optimize it and find some analytics and stuff.
Oh, but data storage is a specific. So, the EU has different laws about where data can live than the US does. And so there are, I think, even in the cloud, some questions about sort of which AWS hub we're using. Where is this hospital's data going to physically live that we do still have to worry about? But
GDPR related.
GDPR,
Do you
right.
have to build it on your own, or you can use some AWS-specific services to store the data?
Oh, yeah, we definitely use AWS and other, yeah.
There's basically regulated versions or something like that that we use, but it's the same kind of.
Yeah. Not seeing anyone questions.
I have one more question, but
Okay.
no one else.
I mean, I guess if no one else has questions.
Don't be shy, guys. Okay, so how do you typically divide the roles in your teams? You showed us like
Oh, yeah, yeah.
different skills and responsibilities. So what does your typical product team looks like?
In the early,
Something, which one is more productive if one person can do
oh, yeah, yeah,
skills or is specifically
right.
one?
Good question. So in the early days, when we were small, we had balanced teams that were very nice and self-contained: PM, product designer, and engineers. And I would say back then, product managers and product designers are about 60 to 80% overlap, right? I would write Jira stories sometimes. The PM I was working with would mock stuff up, or maybe do some wireframes. And we would all do research together. We just when we were a small team, right? One of us would facilitate, one of us would take notes, and it was a very collaborative process. As we've grown, I think PMs have their overhead of dealing with Jira stories and teams and multiple teams of engineers and all of that has ballooned, and so designers really don't touch most of those details anymore. Similarly, design spearheads research. PMs don't really have the bandwidth now to deal with the sort of scheduling and planning something out and figuring out the script and stuff. And so, research has fallen largely under product design, but we still will go to the sessions and do them collaboratively. So, yeah, I mean, I guess maybe in Vineti today, the product designer does a lot is accurate, but that's only because I didn't add other product manager skills. It's not.
So
we don't do more than the PMs. We just do different things now.
it looks like the whole work is done by product design.
Yeah, but that's because this is design skills. This is the UX toolbox. To the question of what's sort of the more efficient or productive method, I think it really depends on the company, and it depends on just how you want to divide those hats, but also on the size. So the bigger the company, if there is a bunch of, we just have to manage information, or we just have to always be doing research, or we're always analyzing our data, then it makes sense to have a data scientist and an information architect and a user researcher as distinct roles or distinct teams. In a small company, everyone has to do everything, right? So as the first designer, I did all of these things, right? You just have to be able to figure out what's needed and do that. And 1 month it's focused on getting research, and another month it's focused on mocking things up, and it's going back and forth. So you're much less efficient as an individual, but you have a wider range of problems you can tackle depending on the priority.
Do you actually have so much load on just one product that you have so many professionals that are working on one skill?
So yes, but not in this way. So at Vineti, we're still product manager, product designer, engineers. We now have Scrum Masters in between who manage sort of the day-to-day engineering backlogs, and PMs are focused more on, sort of preparing the details that then have to be the day-to-day operations or more managed by Scrum Masters. Design is still design, still does really most of these things. But now we're supporting more teams. And so in that sense, our role hasn't scaled in the same way. In the places where we actually have more specialization is now, it used to be that the product team did everything. We would go talk to the customers and write the scenarios and explore the solutions and then design them and then build them, and that was, the company was product. But now we have the product team when we have the customer success team. So now we're focused on building the tools that the customer success team is using to go to a customer and say, what do you need, and can we configure it? And they have their own engineers and their own analysts who are doing the kind of, not exactly research, but gathering specifications and providing solutions that we used to do, because a lot of those are now repetitive. And so we're focused on what's the new stuff that we need to build.
I have two more.
Two more questions, great.
Do you do A/B testings, and do online user testing, so you go and talk with actual customers.
Yeah.
And do you see any risk in doing A/B testing?
Yeah,
based
like
on the industry?
changing the components of the therapy. Let's try this option.
Yeah. So yeah, the second question was unnecessary because yeah, A/B testing is dangerous in hospitals. You basically can't. The closest we get to A/B testing is prototyping different solutions and getting feedback from customers and sometimes live feedback from users. But we don't. We really can't do like online usability testing sort of stuff. If we're going to test something in a hospital or in a pharma company, we have to basically get access to go there with a prototype and sit down. And best case, we go into the apheresis room where the nurses are collecting blood from a patient when they're not working, and say, hey, here, use our tool and tell us which machine you're using and where is the patient sitting and what are you doing right now, what else are you paying attention to? And we can get feedback live for any number of versions of a prototype. But we can't really do that dynamically and we can't really do it remotely.
So you have been with Vineti from the beginning, right?
Yes.
How you were dealing with the change management, like working with the business team, and how much influence you had or design department had on business decisions. And the second question is like, you are in a really difficult space. Like, what was that moment that you have reached that MVP phase? Because like, without regulations, you can't confirm that you are like working company and product, and without having the product, you can't get the
Right.
regulations.
Yeah. No, that second one's really interesting. So to the first one, my boss, who at the founding of the company was the head of product and engineering, he understood why design was important, and he gets a lot of credit for saying, hey, before we hire engineers to build anything, we need a designer to go and understand the problem and research the needs and prototype solutions and figure out that we're confident we're building the right thing. We just hire engineers, it's going to be hard. He also gets credit for helping found the Yerevan office in creating Vineti's presence here. But and so early on, design had a lot of input, right? I was working, we were only 10, 15 people, right, with the whole team. And we were going together and doing research. And so they saw the value of what was being produced. And so I think design had a lot of early buy-in from a team that otherwise didn't have a lot of sort of software product or design experience, right? But once they saw it, it was obvious, and it didn't get a lot of pushback on why are you here, what are you doing, right? It turned into, like our customers find this really useful, and you have good reasons why you're doing stuff, and you're gathering the evidence to convince them to do these hard things, and so this is great. We're a design-forward health company. So that part was good. As far as getting stuff off the ground, so there are sort of two things about Vineti as a company, the way it was founded, that are a little bit unique. So a lot of startups, tech startups, and sort of doing consumer products, you're right, you have to go find your product market fit, you have to convince people that it's interesting, and then you have to go raise money for it, and then hopefully get the resources to build something real. Vineti was a little bit backwards. We were a result of a big pharma company coming to GE Ventures, where we were originally incubated, and saying, we need software to do this, it's too complicated to do it manually. And so we had product market fit from day one.
You kind of outsourced or like doing some product for them and then become the company?
No, they were looking for, they were basically going to different software vendors and saying, do you have a software solution that can do this? But it was a new process, it wasn't like existing ERPs or anything else, and so they were trying to decide, can we buy this from someone or do we have to build it? And so Vineti came from us saying, this is an opportunity, let's found a company to do it. So we already knew, the founders knew going in that this was already a need in the market, we just had to solve it. And so because of that, our first customer, our first pharma customer was basically sold on slides. based on the fact that we had this multidisciplinary founding team. We have 8 co-founders who come from all of those different fields, right? We had someone from tech and startups, and someone from pharmaceuticals and from manufacturing and from regulatory backgrounds, and so that it was sort of like an all-star team that was going to another pharma company and saying, look, we know this is necessary. We know that you're not going to be able to scale this software. We have clearly this, great team of people who have the expertise to build it. And that's how we got sort of, they were our first customer that we built it for, and we already knew that it was a fit for the market. And then everything else was about scaling. Yeah.
You organize design sprints or some workshops that are effective at collaboration.
Do we do that? Is that the question? Yeah, we've done design sprints periodically. They're not kind of a regular part of the process. We've used them more for like, should we explore this new area, right? So our product does this today. Do we want to add this functionality? So let's go and gather other examples and sort of spend a week deciding, like, is this, how would we try to approach this? Is it worth approaching it? And then our CEO would make a decision about that. But that's been kind of here and there. I think mostly we tend to have a team focused on the future and a team focused on the next 3 to 12 months. And so that team the first team is doing a lot of the research of what we're trying to learn about, go and talk to other companies or industry folks, and evaluating that as like a regular process.
Do the farm companies use the product during the clinical research stage, like before go to market?
Yeah, totally. So one interesting aspect of personalized medicine is that it's the future, right? Like cell and gene therapies for leukemia are much more effective than chemotherapy, and they're also much safer, right? Chemotherapy is horrible for the body, and the chances aren't amazing that you're going to survive. And the 2 commercialized treatments on the market are 70 to 80% effective, and there's sort of one potential dangerous moment in the treatment where someone's immune system has a strong response, but otherwise there's no side effects, or no, well, asterisk. And so, in a lot of ways, these specialized treatments, once they exist for everything, this is just going to be a better way to treat disease, especially rare diseases, especially sort of challenging diseases. But they're new, and so they're taking a long time to get through clinical trials, and the commercial market is still not that big. So we can't just sell to commercial customers. So our initial customer was, we created a solution for them so that they could get commercial approval. But from there, we've sort of had to go backwards and say, hey, all these clinical trials, if you use Vineti early, if we make, a sort of more minimal, cheaper version, then you can train your staff and train hospitals on this as a clinical trial, and then no one has to relearn everything when you do a commercial launch. And so that's kind of become our strategy. We're not just waiting for the trial to be successful. We can help make the trials faster.
Like, let's say,
or
your
easier.
customer are exact farm companies, or any farm company can use. And it's interesting to know the roles. Like, it's a collaboration among company, doctors, and the patients.
Mm-hmm.
And the doctors using patients' data, like they recording the data, and farm companies do their analysis. Did I get right?
Sort of. Right now, there's not such a high volume of treatments that sort of big data analysis is a huge part of the picture. That is obviously going to be important, and the data is critical. But what was I going to say? So it isn't usable by any pharma company, right? It's specifically companies that are developing cell and gene therapy, like personalized treatments. So in particular, like autologous processes where the ingredients, the raw ingredients, are coming from the patient and then coming back to the patient, or a personalized medicine where maybe we're a match and you donate something and then a dose is produced and I get it because we have a compatibility. But it's that extra complexity that we automate. Pharma companies who aren't doing that sort of a treatment, they can use normal drug manufacturing tracking stuff that's just make a bunch of things in a factory. And we're not useful for that, or at least we're not adding any extra value there.
Like the main players are doctors and the pharma companies, yeah?
I mean, our sort of. I mean, doctors are a big stakeholder. So doctors at academic medical institutions are the ones who are deciding, do we want to offer this clinical trial treatment? Do we want to run this trial? Do we want to sell this new commercialized therapy? Is it good enough for our patients? Is it affordable? You know, they are making decisions about that. But it's primarily pharma companies who are designing and testing these treatments.
Okay, thank you.
Do you also go into logistical parts, physically transporting the nutrients or the components? Do you do that, or?
No, we don't do that physically. We integrate with specialized couriers,
Yeah.
and so there's certain scheduled milestones. So blood is collected, and then if it's frozen, then things are a little more flexible. If it's not frozen, then there's 48 hours for it to be picked up and get to a manufacturing facility. And so we orchestrate, depending on when the collection is scheduled, making sure the courier gets there and tracking it to the destination, and sort of, we coordinate the logistics. We don't do the logistics.
Yeah, and you also maybe log all the information about how was it, the condition, is it good or bad, is it on time or not?
To an extent, it depends on what the courier offers, right? If if the container monitors that, then we can potentially integrate and get that information. We're not, but we're using what information they can provide. Yeah.
Is it an automated process? Do you integrate with APIs or something, or just manual data entry?
A little of everything. Every courier, especially specialized couriers, are different. So some of them have APIs that'll support, creating the order and updating everything. And some of them, maybe you can create an order, but you have to call somebody, or you can't change it unless you're 5 days. So there are lots of little rules that make that more complicated. But to the extent that we can, we automate it. But a lot of it depends on, again, our partners and if their technology is good enough for us to do that.
Thanks.
Are you planning in the future use AI in your product? Or you already use it?
Oh man, yeah. Are we going to use AI? Are we going to use blockchain? Yeah. I mean, theoretically, there's applications, right? So, I mean, AI, like machine learning, is mostly useful if we have lots and lots of data. And right now, these treatments are pretty small scale. So there isn't an ocean of data to analyze to get much benefit from that. But obviously, once we have that, that'll be really great, because it's super complicated. It's hard to analyze manually. And then, similarly, right, blockchain in pharmaceuticals, the ability to track things more confidently. There is potential application, but we're not really there today. Yeah.
And what about new researching tools like AI tools to get more higher percent of race data, like EEG systems, or I don't know.
What systems?
EEG or eye tracking systems.
Oh,
Researching.
yeah. No, we don't really use anything like that. I mean, a lot. Yeah, I don't know. Theoretically, stuff like that could be useful, but a lot of our processes, because they are sort of individually manual, right? A nurse working with a patient, or someone in a manufacturing facility in a clean room. It's not like there are lots of people doing the same thing over and over again that we can monitor and potentially increase efficiency. That would be more traditional manufacturing sort of work, if I've understood your question. Cool. This has been great. Okay. Yeah. No.
My question is more about product team management. Do you have something more specific ceremonies or kind of meetings to increase product thinking or level up UX maturity in the team, kind of specific to Vineti?
Yes, sort of. I mean, we do share outs and we do internal trainings and whatnot to, either review decisions we've made or talk about different areas of design that other parts of the company could find useful, and kind of share that internally. We don't have an ongoing sort of specific training program really today, but Yeah, we've done different things over the last 5 years. Yeah. It feels like the questions are petering out, and also it's gotten warm in here. Shall we call it?
I think so. The last question then.
Okay.
Vineti is known for using extreme programming and like very good processes in teams. So how does it affect your design process? Is it connected anyhow or not?
Yeah, so I think the biggest impact of XP on design has just been the pairing aspect of XP. So, so extreme programming, for those who don't know, is a flavor of Agile where one key piece is paired programming, right? Two developers working on the same machine where one person is doing stuff and the other person is kind of talking, and you kind of trade out who's driving and whatnot. And that practice, as a designer, sort of I already seem valuable, but it was sort of interesting to do that more regularly. I think a lot of designers, and this is sort of a tangent on like designer culture in general, right? Like there's one designer stereotype, which is I'm the genius, I'm gonna go over here, I'm gonna solve the problem, and I'm gonna give it to you. And there's so many problems with that because like, did you talk to a user? Did you get feedback? Like, why do you think that's good? You haven't tested anything. And so that's a problematic, I think, designer image and designer mindset. Designers should always be collaborative, right? It's always about what's your problem? Let me see. Can I watch you do it? Here, I have an idea. How is this? Oh, I'm going to make it better. Okay, does this make more sense? And it's constant feedback. So there's always collaboration. But XP introduced for me the idea of like, well, why don't we just always have two designers at the whiteboard or two designers in Figma, becoming more of a regular practice, right? And becoming less self-conscious about, anybody seeing how bad my layers are organized or things like that. And so I think that was really valuable for me as a designer, the idea that just pairing as really a regular thing. And we built in, design dev pairing as well. So, hey, every month or two, let's sit down for a couple hours and a designer and an engineer, and we can pair on like, let's walk through like the CSS is off here, or like this interaction. It's not worth necessarily trying to prototype it and making a formal design, but if we're sitting there and it's like, can we tweak that? You can kind of talk through it really pretty efficiently. Not once we've sort of platformized, it's been harder. Everything is really hard to change now, so we can't really sit down one-on-one and actually fix something significant. But in the early days, that was a really nice habit. And at least on engineering, that has continued to be the case. I believe, well, you can shake your head if I'm wrong, but engineers still pair. On some teams, not at all. Pairing happens. Okay, well, apparently, inconsistently, pairing happens. And designers still, not everybody on the team, it's not like a fundamental part of our process anymore, but a lot of us have weekly pairing sessions with each other to go talk through what are you working on, what am I working on, get feedback from each other, hang out in Miro or in Figma and work on something. And that's, I continue to believe very strongly that pairing in design is super useful for working through a lot of iterations quickly. Right? It's easy as an individual. I've been staring at this for 45 minutes. I feel like I'm not done. I really need to keep focusing on it, but like I should take a break. But if someone else is there, they can just be like, oh, I have an idea, and like, oh, well, I have another idea, and then you can really keep the momentum going, and it's super useful. So those of you who have not tried pairing as designers, highly recommend it. It'll feel really weird, and you'll be shy at first, but then you'll be like, oh, this is amazing. I can do so much more. I can move faster, and it's kind of exhausting, but like, oh my God. Yeah. So yeah, thank you everybody for coming.
All right, guys. So it's networking time. We have some food and drinks to have a nice time. So please get to know each other. And thanks.
Yeah, thank you. This is great.
Thanks.
That